Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time it is, wherever you're watching this webinar. And welcome to our early webinar. Today we're going to talk about language certificates. We're trying to understand whether a language certificate can actually be a valid teaching aid in itself. In particular, we'll be focusing on reading tasks. Now let's think about language certificates. How many do you know about? I'm sure there are many. Do you encourage your students to take any internationally recognized qualification? Perhaps you do. And are you involved in any of these? Maybe you are. But whatever the answer, these certificates exist. And there is a lot of material out there available to us teachers. So why don't we take advantage of this? Whether our students take these exams or not, we do, after all, test and assess all the time. And why do we test and assess? Well, for example, for placement purposes, we want to put the student in the course at the right level. Or for diagnosis purposes, we need to understand whether we have to carry out some remedial work to check the student's progress, how far they've got to in the syllabus. We need to check their achievement. Have they reached the level they should reach? We need to check their proficiency, and the list can go on. So how is this webinar organized? We're going to have a quick overview of language certificates, and then we'll look at details of reading tasks from one particular language certificate. We'll try to understand the underlying rationale. So why is that task in this way? What is it trying to test? I'll try and give you some ideas for teaching, the idea of how can we use these tasks for our own teaching purposes, and I will provide you with some stepping stones towards the final objective of the reading tasks. I will be making reference to the handout that you've received, which also includes passages that are suitable for CLIL, for culture and citizenship, and so on. Now, in particular, I want to take into consideration Cambridge qualifications. The reason for this is because there is a clear reference to the Common European Framework of Reference with this idea of stacking of levels. Basically, the idea is if a candidate obtains a narrow fail, that candidate will get a certificate but at a lower level. If instead the candidate has performed particularly well with distinction, then that candidate will get the certificate at the next level. In particular, I wanted to look at level B1 preliminary. The reason for this is because it would be more familiar probably than lower levels and not as difficult as higher levels. It straddles A2, B2 levels with tasks that are similar with other papers in other level exams. And in itself, the tasks are becoming more homogeneous across the different exams for Cambridge. So what we look at for preliminary may apply also for others. So the very, very detailed look at the reading paper of preliminary. It lasts 45 minutes. It includes 6 tasks for a total of 32 questions. Now, these are the tasks that are included. We're talking about tasks which become increasingly more complex from a cognitive point of view, so the order actually reflects difficulty, and this can be useful for us as teachers to understand how difficult a certain passage or test might be. Now, for each task that we'll be looking now at in detail, I would like to look at it this way. First of all, think about what the task consists in. So basically, what does it focus on and what is it testing? Then trying to understand what the students have to do. It's not only a question of paying attention to details or distinguishing fact from opinion or skimming or scanning. It goes beyond that. We've also got complying with instructions, which will then feed into more transversal skills, academic skills, and soft skills. How do they go about doing it? And doing this, we're actually helping them in learning how to learn. It's a learner training kind of activity. And finally, what we as teachers might use that task for. So let's start. Reading task 1. There is a similar task in Key. It consists in 5 short texts, and each text actually constitutes a question. When I'm talking about short text, this is what I'm thinking about. So it's a notice, a sign, an email, a post-it note, a card. It's a text with few words in the end. And what the students have is a question asking them to understand the text and explain what it means, choosing from 3 options. So what can we do? First of all, get them to think about the context. In this case, it could be something like, where do you think you might see this sign? And once that is in their mind, it might be easier then to start choosing the correct answer. Then they have to pay attention to some of the details. For example, modal verbs. Here we've got can for possibility, must for obligation, will be able to for ability. Modal verbs often come out in this kind of task, so we need to help them revise and consolidate the use of ways of expressing permission, prohibition, advice, possibility, and so on. In this case, the correct answer is going to be B. Why? Because in the text, it talks about handing in books by the end of this Friday. And in option B, it talks about before the weekend. Option A is not correct because option A talks about visiting the sale this week. But on line 2, it talks about the sale running next week. Option C is not correct because it talks about buying old books at the school office. No, the used books are be taken to the school office, but not to buy them, because we can only buy them next week in the playground. So, what can we do? First of all, help them to identify the context of a short message. Who, what, where. Get them to clarify the context in their mind. Help them. Get them to focus on visual information, things like the layout as well. Pay attention to note form. For example, auxiliary verbs might be missing, articles may be omitted. And most of all, pay attention to any modal verbs and what they express. What can we use in class? Well, here we can use a lot of authentic material, notices and signs, information which we find on packaging, our own notes, emails, cards, text messages, postcards, or whatever, or the students. Facebook posts or other social media, and websites. What could be a stepping stone activity for this? Well, for example, we could get them to look at some signs and try to explain what these signs mean in their own words, and then get them to choose the correct option. So the signs have no words. They have to put the words to the signs. Otherwise, we can give them signs with words this time and ask them to match them with the place where they would find them. So we're starting to create a context. And all the time, we're using modal verbs. Now, if you have a look at page 1 on your handout, you will find that there is an example of an entry test which is largely based on these kinds of tasks. Let's move on to reading task 2. There is a similar activity in first and in key, so A2 and B2. What they have here is 5 questions which are given as descriptions, 5 factual texts describing people, and then 8 factual texts describing an offer. The offer could be, for example, a course, a book, a holiday, a movie. Here, for example, it's online evening classes. And what they have to do is they have to match each person to an offer. But there are 3 distractors. Each option can only be used once and all the requirements must be met. So how do the students go about this? Well, let's take, for example, Myla. And let's have a look at what Myla is like, what she's interested in, and what her requirements are. So we underline keywords, find information that matches these keywords, and we pay attention because there might be some distractors. Option E talks about a course, but it talks about details that maybe she's not interested in. Option E talks about a course, but that may also talk about details that she might not be interested in. So we need to discriminate. If we look at option E, we see that it talks about a language qualification, But Mila is not interested in doing an exam. She's interested in joining a conversation class. Maybe she's not exactly looking then for an online learning platform. She would like to learn to speak another language though. And in this offer, speakers will be invited to the lessons. So the correct option is H. So how do the students go about it? First of all, they find and underline the main parts for each person so that they focus their attention. And then they make sure that these requirements are all met by the offer that they're choosing. So what can we do in class? We once again focus on visual information, for example, the layout, and then start paying attention to details such as keywords, similarities between the offer and the description of the person, differences between the description of the person and the offer, and then pay attention to words. What's important here are words with a similar meaning, words with the opposite meaning, or words with a more general meaning. And what can we use in class? Again, authentic material, newspaper and magazine articles, brochures, flyers and leaflets, and websites. And here is a stepping stone. What we have here is we have a short text with 5 teenagers talking about their hobbies. And what we give them is a very basic true and false exercise. But this is helping them, training them to pay attention to the details. And then we can do a personalization kind of activity where we ask them to talk about their hobbies. Because if they can in some way identify with the particular person, they will choose the offer that is suitable for that particular person because it would have to meet all the requirements if it was them. Another stepping stone activity is here. We've got the description of 4 colleges where students can study fashion. The first activity is a very simple fill in the table where they actually have to match one of the colleges, for example, with the fashion designers. So it's an easy matching activity. Followed by some lead-in questions asking them in which college they can do certain things. So it's a very basic matching kind of activity. Now, if you look at the handout, pages 2 to 5, you will find 2 different reading passages which focus on culture and citizenship. On pages 2 and 3, you have a text on UK population and identity. You have actually a little glossary corner which you can compile with your students, either with definitions or translations. You have a true-false activity and also a matching task similar to this one. On pages 4 and 5 instead, you have a passage on multicultural New York. First, they have to put events into order, and then they have another matching task. Let's move on to reading task 3. This is a multiple choice kind of exercise. And there is a similar activity in key and in first. So what does it consist in? Well, it's probably the most typical kind of reading comprehension task where they have a question with several option answers, 4, and they have to choose the right option depending, relating to the text that they have just read. So this time it's a longer text. So text is becoming increasingly longer, and this text includes now opinions and attitudes. So it's no longer just facts. We're starting to look at opinions and attitudes. So how do the students go about doing it? Here we have the questions. And let's take one in particular. We're taking question 2. The first thing we do is try to locate where the information which answers that question is in the text. So we identify keywords. And here the keywords is how her parents felt, Olivia's parents felt. Then we locate the information in the text. They expressed doubts. They were worried. And then we find the information that matches the keywords. So, for example, in sentence B, option B, talks about uncertain. It was a good idea, and that is the correct answer. So how would the students have to deal with this? They would have to read the text quickly first to get the gist, to understand the text globally. Then look at the questions, but not the options. And they identify keywords. At that point, they locate the information in the text before reading the answers because those might confuse them. At that point, they find the option which matches what is in the text, having doubts, uncertain. What is very important is that they avoid word spotting. They need to underline the parts which support the answers, and they need to find reasons for rejecting the others. Now, they need to be very careful as well, though, because question 5 refers to the whole text. Here, for example, it says, what might Olivia say to a teenager looking for a part-time job? It's a kind of prediction exercise. Now, the final question, question 5, is a question that is more related to opinion, attitude, main idea, summary, purpose of the writer. There is an element of speculation, and in fact, we've got the modal verb might. So what can we do in class? First of all, get them to focus on the global message before they look at detailed information, and particularly if they're looking at question 5. But the first question, the first activity to do is actually read the text first so that they sort of put it into some kind of perspective. Then they start distinguishing attitude and opinion from fact. And help them practice skimming and scanning, finding a certain word, finding a certain piece of information, ignoring all the rest, not paying attention to words that they don't know. What can we use? Once again, newspaper and magazine articles, websites and blogs. But we can also use simple or simplified passages from books, for example, the graded readers, and these can be fiction and non-fiction. Here's a stepping stone activity. There is a passage for the students to read. There is a small glossary in the bottom. Again, students can either put a definition or a translation, depending on what you choose. And the students have an activity which is similar to the one before, but slightly more challenging, because they don't only have true or false, they also have not given, doesn't specify. So this is where they have to really justify why they're choosing an answer. Otherwise, you could give them a text to read, ask them to read, for example, the first paragraph quickly and answer open-ended questions. And then look at the final question. What is the main purpose of the text? Now, what's interesting here is that they start getting familiar with reporting verbs. For example, discuss, encourage, describe, advertise. So, what is important is that they start practicing skimming, scanning, looking for purpose, and reporting verbs. In the handout, you've got some passages which cover also culture and citizenship. For example, on page 6, you have a passage on the future of our planet with a true, false, and not given task. Or pages 7 and 8, you have a passage on borough market. There is a scanning task where they have to match some numbers to facts, and then they have a multiple choice task. So you can easily adapt it also for other kinds of purposes. Task 4. Task 4 is a gapped text. So we have a text with gaps. There are 5 gaps, and each gap corresponds to a sentence that has been removed. But they have 8 options to choose from. So what the students have to do is they have to choose the correct sentence which fills each gap. There are, however, these 3 distractors to reduce the guessing factor. There is a similar activity in first, and this activity is rather challenging because the students are beginning to focus not so much on content, but on what provides coherence and cohesion. And this will gradually spill over into their writing skills. What holds a text together? What makes it logical? So, how would they go about doing it? Let's take the first paragraph where we have gap 1. We have a question here. Is city life better than the countryside for young people? Two teenagers, so we've got the link with the young people, Mina and Sophie decided to find out what if city life is better than the countryside. Then we have a gap, followed by this meant this what, whatever was in the gap. This meant that for 2 weeks, Mina left behind her home to live with Sophie's family in a small Scottish village. At the same time, Sophie packed her suitcase to experience 2 weeks of Mina's city life in Manchester, England. Here are the options. Now, which of these options completes the gap? It's going to be D. D says the girls. The girls recently appeared in a television documentary where they exchanged homes. The girls. Which girls? The two teenagers mentioned before the gap. They exchanged homes. And then it says, this meant, this what? This exchange of homes. Where Mina went to Sophie's family and Sophie went to Mina's city. Now we might have thought that B was the correct answer. They agreed to spend some time together to get to know the city. But it can't be. Because afterwards it says, this meant that Mina left behind her home to live in Scotland and Sophie went to Manchester. But that wouldn't have happened if they were spending time together getting to know the city. This would mean simply that Mina remained where she was and Sophie went to visit Manchester together with Mina. So how do the students have to deal with this kind of task? Well, first of all, they read all the text once again, get the global meaning of the text. Then they look at what comes before and what comes after the gap. And they pay attention to synonyms, to pronouns. For example, we looked at the pronoun this, but also articles, for example, the definite article the. The sentence must fit in logically. So they look at the topic, they look at any connectors that might be there. For example, if there are any time sequencers, or for example, the verb tenses, which will give some kind of chronological order. If there are any elements of comparison. Once they have decided, they read the text again and decide if it makes sense. So what can we do in class? Get the students to understand the general message and the structure of the text. Now, this is something that is a little bit more difficult because students tend to look at the content of a text, but generally they don't pay a lot of attention to the way a text is organized and held together. So they need a lot of guidance with us asking us explicitly, get them to focus on elements such as pronouns so that they see the cohesion and the coherence. What lexical field does this belong to? And so on. Let's look at synonyms, conjunctions, and so on. Any general nouns, any articles. What can we use in class? Again, we can use authentic material, websites, newspapers and magazines. But we can also use simplified passages if we want to. Now here is a stepping stone activity. Before actually showing you the text and looking at the task, look at the title of the article. So we're asking them to focus on the title. This is something that students tend to ignore most of the times. And get them from here to predict. And after that, read the text and see if the prediction was correct. At that point, we look at the gap. We've ignored the gaps so far. And we help them and say, okay, we have two options that could possibly fit in here. Which one is the most appropriate? And with guided questions, we get them to decide. Otherwise, we can give them a longer passage. First of all, we get them to relate to the passage, see if in some way what the passage describes can be connected or linked or related to their own experience. And then what they're doing is they have 6 gaps, so no distractors, but they don't have a full sentence that's being removed, but just part of a sentence to make things a little bit easier. And then, of course, once they're finished, they read it to see if it makes sense. In the handout, you have pages 9 to 13, which again cover culture and citizenship, where you have on pages 9 and 10 a text on crowdfunding, where you have to match this time removed headings. So it's a kind of stepping stones because they have headings, but your headings summarize the content of a paragraph. So that is also an interesting activity because we're getting to activate the summarizing skills. And then there are some open-ended questions. On page 11, there is a blog on books, but only 3 sentences have been removed in this passage, but they have a true, false, not given activity. And in page 12 instead, they have a review on books, and this time they have 6 sentences that have been removed and a matching task at the end. So we're going back to looking at some tasks that they've already seen before. Task 5 is a multiple choice clause. So what they have is they have a passage with 6 gaps, and for each gap they have 4 options to complete. Now the focus here is on lexis, collocations and fixed phrases. So basically vocabulary, the whole area of vocabulary. There is a similar activity in key and in first. So what do the students have to do? Choose the correct word that fits into the gap. So how do they go about doing it? Let's have a look, for example, at gap 6, which was the one at the end. Don't forget to, it's sandy western beaches, and these are the options. Now the only possibility is explore, because look, travel and arrive require a preposition. So how do the students go about it? The first thing is, once again, they read the whole text. This is something that students tend to forget to do. They tend to reach the gap and immediately choose the option. Then they try to guess the missing word. And this is without looking at the options, because they tend to get confused when they see the options. At that point, they look at what comes before and what comes after the gap, and they go to choose the option. Finally, they read the text again to check that it makes sense. So what can we use in class? What can we do in class? We can focus on the global message before the detailed information. This is helping them across their reading skills. Get them to understand the general message and the structure of the text, once again. And then we start focusing on collocations, and this is whenever we're doing any reading passage, we can dedicate a few minutes to collocations. Get them to pay attention to synonyms or near synonyms, so words with a similar meaning, or words that belong to the same semantic field. Pay attention to false friends. Focus on idiomatic expressions and fixed phrases, and on word patterns, also simply by asking them what word, what preposition do we use after the adjective afraid, for example. And this we can do with any reading text. What can we use in class? Any passage at a suitable level, because we're testing vocabulary, so it has to be at the level they can deal with. And we can make our own closed texts when we decide to focus, for example, on specific points, which could be, this time we're focusing on, for example, words related to food or clothes or whatever. And here is a stepping stone activity. There is a shorter text, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's quite short, relatively simple, and we only give them 3 word options. So what we have is, 3 option items. But what we do is we ask them to explain the differences, or why one is suitable and the others aren't. For example, let's look at option 4, the difference between a bookstore, a bookcase, and a library. Otherwise, we can give them a passage and ask them lead-in questions. So what can you see? And this is a house in a tree. And they read the text quickly and answer these open-ended questions, like what does the text talk about? And then we start guiding them through the options with questions such as, which word means, or like in question 5, what do you put on a bed? Or question 6, which word best collocates with new? So we're actually guiding them and helping them learn these collocations. Task 6 is an open clause. So what they have is, once again, they have a text with gaps, but with no suggestions. And what they have to do is they have to think of the word that is missing. The focus here is no longer on vocabulary, but it's on awareness and control of grammar. So basically words such as pronouns, articles, prepositions, linkers, and so on. So the students need to think of the word that fits in grammatically into the sentence and fills the gap. So how do they go about doing it? For example, I've taken the sentence around gap 3. And what I need here is going to be a conjunction. And in some way, I'm setting a condition here. So the word I need is unless. So what do the students have to do? They have to read the whole text first, once again. Try to think of the word that is missing. Here we said it's a conjunction. Look at what comes before and after the gap. Look at the whole sentence and then read the text again to make sure it makes sense. And here are a few reading tips. So what can we do? First of all, think about the different ways we read. Students are not used to reading and paying attention to those words that give cohesion and coherence to a text. Those little grammar words that act as linkers and connectors and auxiliaries. They tend to focus more on content words. Get them to understand the general message and the structure of the text and to practice skimming and scanning. Encourage them to ignore unknown words or to guess the meaning from the context. And get them to focus on what comes before and after the gap, because once again we're looking at coherence and cohesion. What can we use? Any adapted entries from encyclopedia or Wikipedia, so we're feeding into CLIL. Or any simple or simplified passages from books. So once again, graded readers. Ailey has lots of wonderful graded readers, both fiction and non-fiction. And here is an idea for a stepping stone. It's a blog, a very simple blog, and there are some missing words, and you can get the students to guess the words. Otherwise, you can actually give them a text, which is a closed text. This is a book blurb. But the option items are no longer vocabulary. We're focusing this time on grammar. Now in the handout, you've actually got activities related to the closed text and the open closed text from page 14 onwards. On page 14, you have a page dedicated to UN agencies where they have to insert the words that are given in the gaps. On page 15, you have a closed text on lockdown hobbies, where there is the multiple choice option items are a mixture of grammar and vocabulary. On page 16 and 17, you have two texts. One is on comfort food and one is on the Berlin Wall, where the students have to think about the missing word. There's no suggestion. And on the Berlin Wall passage, they also have an activity which is based on scanning with matching figures and facts. Now, if you've noticed, these activities have become increasingly more difficult. We started with a very short passage, very short texts, which were signs or notices. Then we moved on factual texts matching people and authors. Then we moved to multiple choice, where we were focusing on the content of a passage. Then we moved on to looking at coherence and cohesion with removed sentences that had to fit in logically. We then moved on to looking at the vocabulary. And finally, we looked at the grammar of passages. Now, all the activities that we saw were taken from these wonderful books: Discover B1 Preliminary for Schools, Sprint 4, Ready for Planet English Pre-Intermediate, both student book and workbook, and Ready for Planet English Intermediate, the student book. And here are the contact details if you want to reach out to us: international@aileyonline.com. You can follow us on Facebook with Ellie Publishing. Register on www.ellieonline.com, and finally like us on YouTube on Ellie Multimedia. I hope you had some new ideas to help you with your teaching and to take advantage of all the wonderful material that is out there preparing for language certificates. Thank you for listening. Bye.